Okay, so hello everyone, and welcome to the World Transform Festival. Today we're really privileged to have Kevin Lin for this important session on China. Kevin is a labor activist and researcher on China's labor movement. He's the managing editor of Asian Labor Review, a movement publication analyzing labor movements across Asia. Most recently, he's the co-editor of The China Question, Toward Left Perspectives, published by Verso. So let's get into this. So we're going to do a session which is broadly divided into four parts. We're going to look at what the Chinese economic miracle is, what the Chinese political system looks like, and what social movements and labor struggles are present in China at the moment. And then the fourth part will be about international relations and the One Belt, One Road initiative. Then we'll have questions at the end with enough time for all of you to have your questions answered. So what we're thinking is throughout the sessions, if you have any questions or anything you want Kevin to expand on, please put it in the comments so that we can collect them throughout the session. So to begin, Kevin, I was going to ask you, so what is the Chinese economic miracle, and how do we understand this as progress?
Thank you so much. Really appreciate the opportunity to join this session. Maybe before I answer the question, I would just say a little bit more about myself, just so for people to understand where my perspective comes from. So I was born in mainland China. I was born in Beijing and grew up there before my family moved abroad. I got really interested in labor issues in China right around 2009, 2010. It was a period of very intense militant worker struggle in China. And I was really part of a large cohort of people, young people at the time, who were drawn to labor movement, to labor issues in China because of the fact that, we observed how workers, by taking collective actions, are able to manage to transform their conditions. So that was something that always stayed with me. So it's also, of course, relates to this question of China's miracle, Chinese miracle, because that's very much the pinnacle, the high point of China's economic growth. So I think it's useful to remind ourselves that China, for most of the last 20, 25 years until recently, were growing at a speed that was very like high single digit or even double digits. So when we're talking about 2009, 2010, the Chinese economy was growing at about 10% a year. It began to decline after the great financial crisis in 2007, 2008, but still managed to grow at about 7-8% until very recently. So I do think we need to acknowledge the extraordinary economic growth that has taken place in China. But at the same time, I think it's important to demystify what this miracle actually is.
Yes. And yes, and this is what I think is really important, because we're told about China being a very powerful nation, and there's been a lot of progress and huge economic growth. But I was wondering if you could explain to us how does this translate to the everyday living condition of the masses? So if there has been such incredible economic advancement, how do everyday Chinese people live? Like, what is the benefit for them in this?
Definitely, I think, and here it's important to look at the class differences, right? So, the vast majority, until recently, the vast majority of the Chinese population were peasants or people who live in the countryside, and at the beginning of China's economic reform in the 1980s and 90s, they began to emerge this class of new working class, who are basically like just how every capitalist economy industrialized, right? There's people from the countryside coming into the city and working the factories. And China repeated that story of absorbing a large number of peasants into a urban working class. So for this new working class, the conditions were horrible for 10, 15 years. It was really when we conjure up the image of sweatshop, that was their conditions for the vast majority of this new working class. However, their conditions did improve, and I would argue largely because of worker struggle. As I mentioned, there were, Chinese workers were never passive. They organize mostly autonomously, namely that, because there's only one trade union federation, which is state affiliated, and they do not organize strikes. So workers had to take it up on themselves to organize strikes. But by doing so, they really improve their conditions. So there's definitely a vast improvement of conditions for the working class. But I should also mention who really got rich. Apart from there's a super rich that is really people who take advantage of their connection to the state. So there are the families and friends of the party state who took advantage of the economic opportunities to accumulate a huge amount of wealth. But there's also middle class who really came out of nowhere, right? Because again, to remind ourselves, during the Mao period from 49 to 76, there was really no middle class to speak of. Right? Everyone's a worker or peasant, or if you work for the government, but otherwise there was no middle class. So there's a huge growth of middle class, which became sort of the bedrock of state legitimacy, because the government can point to the middle class and say, oh, we are able to deliver this huge economic growth and prosperity and upward social mobility. Therefore, we are worth your support.
Right. So you're saying there's a huge middle class that's benefited from this, and what I wanted to ask you was, how does this work with, let's say, welfare provision? Because we have in a lot of the kind of like UK or US based understanding, we have this idea that welfare provision was very key to the stabilizing capitalism, but also having upward social mobility for different classes, and especially stabilizing the middle class. So for example, what's the role of the state in welfare provision at the moment in terms of healthcare and education? Is it mostly towards middle class, upward social mobility, or is it quite well distributed?
I would say, there was a period in the 1990s and early 2000s where a lot of the state provided welfares during the Mao period were dismantled or privatized rather. So increasingly over the last 3 decades, the welfare system, healthcare, education, and other benefits are sort of tilted toward the middle class. So if you are born in the city, if you are born to a sort of middle class family, you get a good college education, and that normally means you could get a good job. So there's that upward social mobility, and if you have a good job, you make certain proportion of your salary to social insurance, and that entitles you to pretty increasingly better subsidized healthcare and all that, insurances, etc. However, if you are from the countryside, if you're from smaller town or city, and you were not born to a middle class family and you didn't get a college education, the reality is very different. So it became more 2-tiered or maybe 3-tiered systems where, depending on your class position, you will get very vastly different treatment. And that's, in many ways parallel to sort of neoliberal capitalism that you see in the UK, in the US, and elsewhere.
Okay, so you're saying that there's a class composition of people there's an urban-rural divide, but within the urban areas, is there a middle class and a working class, that there's a clear divide, or is it very much that majority of the middle class lives in an urban way and that there is So I'm trying to understand the movement of the different classes between the urban and the rural areas. What does this look like?
Yeah. So I think about 10 years ago, for the first time in Chinese history, China became an urban society in the narrow sense that over half of the population live in the cities. Prior to that point,
right.
Obviously through all Chinese history, the vast majority of the populations are in the countryside. There's been a huge push by the Chinese government to urbanize. So there is a huge increase of urban populations. But as you said, there is a huge divide between the middle class and the working classes. And if, previously there was always this promise, even for the the working classes, the industrial factory workers, service sector workers, there's this sense that if you work hard, you will also rise. You will get more higher income. You will probably be able to afford a apartment in the cities. So even for the working class, this you can see the Chinese dream. To borrow the American dream, there's a Chinese dream or China dream to improve your situation, even if you're part of the working class. However, there's always a vast inequality in Chinese society. Actually, inequality has been going through the roof for the last 20, 30 years. But the problem now is as China's economic growth slows down, that promise of upward social mobility for both the middle classes and the working class has been diminishing. So that presents a issue for Chinese society right now.
Okay, and this perfectly ties into the next part, which is about the Chinese political system. So we have the state, we have the party, we have a private sector, and the masses of the Chinese people. And the question really is, with this mass industrial output, are there contradictions amongst the state, the private sector, and the workers, and the party? And how are these social relations managed? So what does this look like at the moment?
Yeah, I think on this question, I think many of us on the left internationally have had different opinions, or sometimes I would argue not only differences, but some confusions between the relationship on the relationship between state and capital in China. There's this idea because the state intervenes heavily into the economy, the fact that Chinese state also owns a large amount of state capital, and therefore it means that China is or the Chinese society is not capitalist in that sense. I would argue that's not correct, because I think China in many ways repeats or follows the developmental state sort of economic growth model that were first sort of championed by Japan and South Korea from the 60s all the way to the 80s, and where the state had played a huge role in managing the economy, in developing industrial policies, intervening in economic affairs. So there's that heavy state involvement that is quite typical of East Asian developmental model. On the other hand, I do think there's an interesting question to think about, which is the relationship between state and capital right now. For those who have followed a little bit of Chinese news recently, one of the largest sort of commercial property company in China, it's called Hengda, Evergreen. The head of the company was recently arrested. And actually, that's not a unique development. Over the last few years, some of the largest companies have been the target of what people call regulatory crackdowns by the government. So governments coming in and say, oh, you have to follow the regulations, or you have to, in the extreme case of Alibaba, which is the largest e-commerce platform in China, to break it up because it's got too big. And we can talk more about this. That I think they introduce a lot of risks into the economy that the Chinese state tries to manage and avoid.
I think it's fascinating because we have this idea of neoliberalism in the US, the UK, or in northern industrialized countries where the state intervenes on behalf of capital, right? But what you're saying is that the state has some potential to discipline capital here. That it's not. It feels like it's quite. There's quite a difference here in what as we think of like capitalist development. Here, there is some potential for the state disciplining. So, as you were saying about breaking up Alibaba, why was it broken up? What was the reason it was broken up?
In that specific case, it's a company that has started off as e-commerce platforms, but it kind of developed into other areas, venturing into other areas of the economy, and it started. I think probably the biggest reason is start to disregard regulations by taking up a lot of risks. And that's what you see with a lot of Chinese private companies right now, because it was the past 10, 15 years was a period of high economic growth. A lot of companies saw opportunity to expand But in doing so, they over leverage. So they borrow a huge amount of money to finance their expansion. And it feels okay when the economy is growing and there's a sense they will be able to repay all the debt. But when the economy starts to slow down, their ability to repay the debt calls into question. So now there's so much debt issues, both like local government debt, corporate debt, personal debt, etc., etc. And I think there is a lot of instability that these private companies brought into the system, which I think for the state it's a problem to manage. And I just coming back to your question about in sort of neoliberal sort of economies ideas that the state refrain from intervening to the economy and certainly does not tend to discipline capital. And I think in the Chinese case, the state both support capital. It would support big companies like Huawei, which is a private company, and make them into kind of what in the Korean economic model called national champions. But they also discipline capital when capital is sort of introducing instability into the system. I think the state plays both of those roles. But really, ultimately, I think it's to maintain its own sort of continuing rule, because I know, if there's too much risks and too much instability into the economy, it will ultimately threaten its own rule.
Yeah, and just to expand on this, do you think this is similar to what we saw after the recession, where we had large bailouts after the economic crash? Is it similar, or is it a bit different? Because a lot of people say bailouts take forms in privatization, and a lot of public wealth being transferred into private companies' hands, right? So is this something different, or is it similar in that way? When we're talking about crisis of capitalism expanding, you're saying there's a pragmatic necessity, but is it similar to bailouts, or is it something quite different?
I would say that bailouts, maybe the closer parallel is with Chinese state enterprises or state-owned companies, if you will. So there's a Chinese version of too big to fail or too important to fail.
Right.
I think the Chinese government is probably less willing to buy out big private companies, but it's much more willing to buy out state companies. And state companies have taken a lot of risks as well. Like state-owned banks have lent all this money to private companies, thinking they will get paid back. And also there's this, who's gonna let state banks to fail, right? So there's a gaping holes in their accounting books, a lot of loans that are bad. Also local government, right? Decided to invest and in ventures that are not making any profit, and the Chinese government is not going to let local government to go bankrupt. So I think there's a different version of that too big to fail or to the bailout, but it's more to do with the state sector than the private sector.
Okay, and just lastly on this ability of the state to discipline capital, do you think there is potential here for implementing any socialist or progressive policies? Does it provide a space, or do you think it's just the role of the state to regulate and just protect us from further crisis?
So I would argue that the disciplining of the state's disciplining of capital is still taking place within the framework of capitalism. I think it's fundamentally about restoring stability in the system and restoring profitability. I don't think I don't see any sign that is transcending capitalism in what the kind of policies and action they've taken. And I should just quickly add, I think people have look at things like common prosperity, which is a slogan that had been circulating by the Chinese government in a couple of years ago. This idea that, we're gonna share the wealth. But if you look at the substance of that, it's really nothing to do with kind of socialist values and principles or actions. It is still and actually there's very little substance to that. Despite the name, that sounds good. That sounds really good, right? It's like we're going to share the wealth and everyone's get wealthy together. But fundamentally, it's about making people work a bit harder so they can earn a bit more. But there's no, for example, serious redistribution policy, wealthy redistribution policies that we can see. So I think a lot of that is really about making sure capitalism functions properly in China.
Right. And for example, when you have a lot of this ideological messaging, how does the state or the party mechanism mediate the masses? So is this idea of shared prosperity part of a certain type of nationalism, or there isn't much nationalism? Is the difference if it's a different type of ideological messaging? So how does this happen? This kind of mediation to the masses?
Yeah, so I think what with some kind of Chinese government, or sometimes in academic literature, people call it the party state, because there's that fusion of the Communist Party and the state bureaucracy. It really portrays itself, and have been doing so for decades, as sort of guardians of Chinese nation.
Right.
And so we're here to take care of the Chinese people. We are really here to revive the Chinese nation. That's kind of the rhetoric that has been coming out of the government in last 10, 20 years or so. And the idea is that, well, we do not need you to organize yourself, right? We do not want workers or peasants or students to organize yourself. So there's for example, basically a ban on any organized presence that is independent state. So there's still to this day, there's no independent trade union in China at all. There's no kind of organized peasant movement or peasant organizations. It's definitely no autonomous students organizations, because I think the states try to remove that kind of organized presence, and instead portray itself as taking care of everyone. But that also has implications, right? So when there's a problem, you don't have organization that can mediate those conflicts.
Right.
Then sometimes even small things can turn into like street protest. Sometimes, of course, a lot of people just choose silence or choose acceptance. But that's also why there have been, again, for the last 20 years or so, huge amount of protests of all kinds in the cities and in the countryside. Precisely, I think, because there are the kind of mediating organizations that permitting mediating role are not permitted to exist.
Right. I definitely want to get back into this about the mediating role, but I wanted to ask you, so how does the party maintain consent and check the pulse of the population? So if we have in comparison to liberal democracies, you have the idea of voting, which is very limited, but it allows people to check the pulse and what's going on. So how does this function? If you're saying there aren't institutions that are independent, how does this function in China then with the party state mechanism?
Yeah, so really, there's really no any serious formal voting system, in politics. Years ago, in the 90s, there was some hope that there would be a village election, so villagers can elect the head of their village. But that kind of the experiment sort of petered out after a number of years. So really, there's no formal mechanism of voting or election to gauge people's consent, or to people's opinions, and then secure consent. So, but I think the government has been pretty good, I would say, at gauging people's opinions. Both there was this idea of people, at least up until recently, the government would monitor online opinions. Right. So what are people saying? And it's kind of interesting, like for again, recently the online censorship has got so strict that it's hard to even really see much of anything. But that the decade 15 years ago, when the online space was much more active, the state is actually able to see, oh, people are complaining about this thing. And sometimes it get resolved really quickly if it's the topic blows up, right? And the government will be like, oh, let's fix this issue because, so that's one way. But I do think there is a increasingly because of increasing control over society and over media, over online opinions and etc. over civil society. I think the state has increasingly has less ability to gauge and respond to public opinions, and I think you start to see that in some of the recent protests where there's like public opinions clearly is going one way, but the action of the state is going the other way.
Okay, so is there something to be said about the material progress that's been made that maintains the social contract? So you're saying there's spontaneous protests, there's strikes, there's industrial action as well that would be a result of rapid economic development. So is there something about the development that feels good enough that it's not something like Arab Spring, let's say, or the North African Spring, what happened in Egypt and different places? So how do, I mean, it might be a difficult question, but majority of the Chinese people, do they feel like things are going well? There are problems, but generally there's a path to progress that's being achieved. Would that be a fair description?
Yes, I think that's right. I think I guess at least up until recently, let's talk about pre-COVID periods. There are independent public opinion polls, many different ones over the years that have been done to gauge Chinese public opinions on their support for what's happening, but for the government. And of course, opinion polls are always very tricky, right? They depending on how your questions are asked and if the people feel they can freely answer those questions. But even taking all of that into account, most of the opinion polls and academic studies that I've seen over much of the 20 years have shown that people overwhelmingly support the current government. There's no huge amount of opposition. I think, again, people are maybe not happy with this particular issues locally, but the opinion for the overall governing situation, the Communist Party, the state has been overwhelming support from the public. That is not to say that there is not huge amount of protests and all that are mostly aimed at local issues. Now, coming back to your question, how do you gain consent when there's an absence of election, right? Of course, I think the two key pillars of the state legitimacy are first of all economic growth, and that including that is upward social mobility for the vast majority of the population. Despite all the inequality and all that, there is a real material improvement in people's conditions. And the other one is nationalism, as I was alluding to before, this idea that the current party state is the guardian of Chinese nation, is able to revive the great Chinese nation. So I think those are the two key pillars, and both are, especially the first one, the economic growth, is coming into some question right now.
Okay, and this kind of nationalism, is it more economic nationalism, or is it based more on a historical past, reclaiming historical past, or is it a mixture? Because I think it's quite a unique situation that you're describing at the moment.
Yeah, nationalism is one of those things that's really, really hard to study because it's not. It's one of the things that is hardly coherent. You can study academically, but like in practice, it's not something that is easy to disentangle or to unpack. But overall, as a vast generalization or simplification, it's essentially about historical grievances, right? The idea that we sometimes refer it very lightly to the central accumulation, but it's lived experience still for within 2-3 generations of people living in China now, that there was colonialism, there was imperialism, there was civil war, and so people do remember periods when there's poverty, there is starvation prior to 1949. So I think people kind of wanted to have probably what people consider as the rightful place in the world, right? Not aggressive. I don't think it's expansionist nationalism in the sense. I don't think the people, your average people in China want to conquer somewhere in Africa or something. I don't think it's kind of expressionist in that sense, although it's different within Asia Pacific region. I think that's a story that we may get into, but it is certainly a sense that nationalism is a key component of the ruling ideology right now.
Okay, and for example, social movements and labor struggles, right? So, what is the
Yeah.
condition of the working class in China right now? So, where are the labor struggles, feminist struggles, and environmental movements in China geographically, and what are their demands if they're present now?
Yeah, so it's a big question. I picked the first two, maybe instead of going looking at labor and feminism. I think those are the ones that are more recent and more sort of urgent. One is, labor struggle is really been interesting. So as I mentioned previously, there's still no independent unions. Right. So workers really just decided to take up upon themselves to take actions.
Just by independent unions, you mean non-state affiliated?
Non-state,
unions.
Yeah. So so basically, if you say I want to set up my own union for this factory or this, you cannot unless you want it to simply to be affiliated with the state affiliated trade union federation. Otherwise, you cannot have non-state unions.
Right.
So you see this massive, very intense and militant worker struggle for about over 25 years, 30 years. And really changed their own material conditions. Like I think when we think about labor costs in China, it has been so-called labor costs have been going up. And I think in large part it's because of workers' struggle to push up their wages and push up their conditions, benefits, and all that. However, it's also where the party state has been very adept to manage. So despite all these struggles, it has now cohered into a large national movement. But I think what's interesting now is, of course, I want to just quickly mention the feminist movement. It's interesting there too. There's been some people have called it a feminist awakening. This idea is not just one or two or three or 100 feminist activists or organization. It's a generalized awareness among women in China of the patriarchy system and the economic system that are discriminating against them. So there's been a massive kind of push for recognizing sexual harassment, sexual assault, and also recognize discrimination. But in both cases, very active movements, but at the same time, I think they come up against a state that is very good at both repressing, meaning arresting, harassing activists, but also at making accommodations. So, for example, when workers go on strikes, and sometimes the local authorities, local union, local state affiliated union will come in and try to mediate the conflict, or sometimes even pay out workers, right? So that workers stop striking. So it's been kind of really interesting dynamic. On one hand, massive amount of protests by workers, by other people in China, other social groups, and social awakening by women, by feminist activists, led by feminist activists. But on the other hand, there is at least on the surface, still very little organized movement in China. So there's a contradiction there, or kind of apparent paradox.
Okay, and just to go back to the labor movement. So are these? But what I feel like you're describing are wildcat strikes, right? So if there are no state oversight, so a lot of these are wildcat strikes that then gain momentum. And what's the frequency of this? Like how often does this happen, or is there specific periods depending on COVID is a big factor in how a lot of economic activity change. So what are the frequency of these strikes?
Yeah, so I think at the peak, I would say the peak is probably around this 10-year period from 2005 to 2015.
Right.
That was a high period of Chinese industrialization, export oriented mostly. Industrialization, and that's where workers were gaining confidence in their actions. So there's no precise statistics, but I think people's estimates will be a few thousand to maybe 10,000 a year for that period. It's since 2015 been sort of slowing down for different reasons, for many reasons. China's economy is changing, so it's moving away from the low-cost manufacturing to more high-tech and service economy. So the kind of industrial struggle has sort of declined over time. But I think also because a lot of industrial relocation, so factories both moving within China to look for cheaper labor, but also moving abroad into Southeast Asia and other places. So there's a weakening of the movement in the last few years.
Okay. And has this changed the relationship between people and land? So if you're saying a lot of this is high-tech companies, where geographically where are they based? And is there cases of, large tech companies going into peasant land or what used to be peasant land, and it causes a certain type of antagonism? Or is it mostly based within the production, the site of production?
Right now, it's mostly in places that have been industrialized, like Shenzhen, right? For example, Shenzhen is this sort of coastal, started as a fishing village in the 70s, before the 1980s, and then became a special economic zone, and became this industrialized mega city. And now it's also become an innovation hub. It's interesting to look at the trajectory of a city, right? It's started as a village, then become an industrial city, manufacturing hub, and then now become an innovation center. But what you mentioned earlier, maybe I should just note that it's there was a massive amount of dispossession but more in the 90s when industrial development sort of took land away from the peasants, and there was massive resistance against that. But since then, now that a lot of as I mentioned, a lot of the rural land have been absorbed into, became little towns and cities, massive amount of urbanization. So it's less struggle around dispossession and more over the last 20 years, 30 years is about over exploitation.
Okay. And is there any potential for international left solidarity with the kind of labor struggles and feminist struggles that happen there? Because I feel like outside of China, especially in Europe and US and UK, we don't see this picture. We see a very, I think outside, there's almost an acceptance of this harmonious social order that's creating so much economic production, and we are missing out the internal contradictions that are happening there. So what would be a way to have solidarity with people there and to understand from each other's struggles?
Yeah, and it's this hard question. It's not it's not something that and I wish we can say there's an industrial or there's labor struggle or feminist struggle right now, and we can just travel there, we can bring people over here to show solidarity. I think that kind of direct solidarity is the most important, but it was also currently quite constrained. So instead, I would suggest maybe a couple of things. One is just kind of following what's happening in China. There's good news analysis, even in mainstream newspapers about labor issues and feminist issues in China. So I think for the left, I would say whenever you're in the UK or elsewhere, I think gaining understanding of what's happening in China, it's not just simply showing solidarity. It's that, but I think it's also right now being, we're looking at a very intensifying, U.S.-China conflict. I think understanding what's happening, the second largest economy in the world with so much happening, I think it's important itself for the left. Second thing is, I think, instead of maybe trying to reach people in China, I think, you will have, say in the UK or in North America, in Europe, there are a lot of Chinese international students and Chinese diaspora. And I think a lot of people are asking questions about, okay, is what's happening in China, going in the right direction. How should I talk about what's happening, right? And I should maybe end on this point. Like I think because of the I would say the kind of economic slowdown and contradiction within capitalism in China, a lot of young people, including a lot of students, young professionals or young workers, are questioning or asking questions. I don't think they have developed necessarily a fully fleshed out politics, but I think there is starting to be a good basis for engaging in critical discussions about what's happening in China, what's happening globally. So I think it's important to start those conversations where you are, rather than I think trying to do something that is quite difficult, which is reach out people in China right now.
Yeah, and I think this brings us to the fourth part of like international relations and the infrastructure development projects, right? So there is the One Belt and One Road initiative. So wanted to ask you, first of all, what is this? What is it, and why is it being implemented?
So I think when people think about One Belt One Road, or sometimes called Belt and Road project, there is a it's actually quite a vacant, this umbrella term that essentially sometimes like all sort of Chinese investment come under that umbrella term. So it's quite a messy kind of a project, if you will. It's not as coherent as maybe it sounds like, but it is part of it. It's just China trying to develop closer trade relations with other countries. But I think, to your question, I think there is a overproduction in China, overcapacity in China, because over this 30-year period, China built up this massive industrial capacity to produce things, but the products not being consumed, or their domestic market is not big enough for this product to be consumed. So there's a need to export some of the industrial overcapacity, and that could be anything ranging from steel, cement to consumer products, right? So there's a need for that, but of course there's, on the other side of that, is underconsumption. On the basically the two sides of the same coin. Underconsumption meaning that in China, the population increasingly even though everyone is economic conditions has been improving, or the vast majority has been improving, it still grows at slower rate than the overall economic sort of development, meaning workers or the populations are not able to have enough income to consume the things that they produce. So there's a need for product to be consumed elsewhere. So it's an interesting kind of development, but it's also quite a how should I say? It's quite a difficult topic to talk about, because it's a moving target. It's been changing. Right. I think there's that outburst of investment. There's like huge amount of outflow of capital from China. But also in the recent years, it's been the Chinese government actually trying to pull back some of the Chinese investment. So it's a moving target.
Okay, so are you saying this is a necessity, in the sense that the Chinese economy needs this because of overproduction, that it needs to be able to expand outwards? So there is another side to this, because you were saying that there is a lot of aggression coming from the US and allied countries, and it's very one-sided, right? It's very dominant from the US at the moment. But at the same time, there are a lot of countries that are inviting China and are hosting China for better economic and political relations. So what's the reason for this?
I think I always recall this conversation I had years ago, I think over 10 years ago, with a comrade from Latin America. And this is the start, 10 years ago, started when China began to really invest heavily in other countries in Latin America, in Africa, Middle East, etc. And I remember him saying, "Oh, we like Chinese investment, right? I don't think he's saying, oh, everything is great. There's nothing bad happening in China, or there's nothing bad with some of the social issue that we just outlined. However, I think for a lot of, let's say, people in Latin America, it's also in Africa, Chinese investment became this counterweight against American or European capital. Or political interferences, especially in Latin America. I think Chinese investment, instead of relying on U.S. or European investment, Chinese investment seem to come with less strings attached, at least at the beginning. So there's a sense, I think this is better than what the Europeans and the Americans are offering. I think there's that. I think there's also legitimate concerns over labor conditions, and you can look at that, for example, over the years in Africa, where Chinese managers have been extremely harsh towards African workers, and there have been some of the major conflicts, I think, resulting in people getting killed and all that. So I think there are also legitimate concerns. I think there's a both side, but I think there's also a lot of, like you were alluding to, European governments and American governments are just unhappy with China asserting or developing a closer relationship with in countries in continent like Africa and Latin America that are traditionally within the sphere of influence of the Europeans and Americans.
Right. So do you think it's a way of other countries to not be under the domination of U.S. Foreign policy and relations? It's seen as is it seen as a more stable alternative? I mean, when we look at wars in Afghanistan and Iraq from a British perspective, there's a lot of destruction, and then a lot of the restructuring of private companies making profits there only happens after a wide-scale destruction, right? So we're not seeing this in this kind of initiative. We're kind of seeing a lot of partnership and a lot of infrastructure building, which doesn't kind of mirror this process. So is that one of the reasons?
Yeah, I think so. I think, again, one could be very critical and look at cases and say, point out problems. And maybe we don't have time right now, but overall, I think a lot of governments are seeing alternative, right? Does Chinese investment are coming here to build roads or build airports or whatever, right? Infrastructures, or they're setting up businesses that employ workers, local workers. So I think they really see that as both a political counterweight, but also economic alternative.
Okay, and one of the reasons that we wanted to ask you was: is there a reason for the reason why the US has so much hostility? Is one of the factors the dependency on China? I mean, if we look at, like, the joke is, right, like, the American dream is manufactured in China. If you just look at iPhones, right, it says it at the back of the actual casing. So is that one of the reasons that there's a resentment of the dependency, or is it something else? Is it more about maintaining what's been the status quo since the Second World War?
I think there's the dependency is pretty entrenched, and again, this dependency is not only about low cost manufacturing, right? So that was true for maybe 2 decades or so, but it's also about infrastructures, about the health and education workers that are available. And also just a domestic market. China is a huge domestic market for goods and services. I mean, iPhone is certainly manufactured in China, but it's also sold in China in massive numbers. So there's been this attempt to rhetoric about decoupling, but I think it's at least right now, it's more kind of aspiration than a reality, because it's not like say American company can simply just get up and go to another country like Vietnam or India. Just everything will be the same. It takes a lot more than just low cost labor to replicate the economic model. So I think it'll be difficult, but I do think there is a sense that, and I should say that maybe very directly, explicitly, I think the current conflict between U.S. and China, I would argue, is primarily driven by U.S. state. I don't think the Chinese state wants a conflict with the U.S. I think the Chinese states are perfectly happy to grow and develop within the current sort of global economic and political order. However, I think that the U.S. state is unwilling to accommodate that and has been really building up both this kind of economic warfare and also increasingly military alliances against China. So I would definitely place the main cause of the current conflict more on the side of the US. But I also do think we need to understand everything within a kind of global capitalism. It's not simply the good guy versus the bad guy. I don't know. It's not simply the US is bad guy and China is everything good. We also need to understand what's happening, especially the social dynamics within China, so that we can develop a internationalist kind of left positions on this question, but without having to, but also recognize there are issues and problems, social problems in China that we need to have a clear understanding of.
Yes, definitely. And we're going to move on to some questions now, which tie into what you were saying. So one of the questions is, what do you make of the brokering of the ceasefire between Saudi Arabia and Yemen, for example, and the more prominent role of China on the global scene? So what's the reason for this, and what do you make of this? Is this very significant?
I do think it's very significant because I think, if you will, the U.S.-led global order, basically after the Second World War, has. I think China the Chinese state is quite happy to be part of that, rather than try to. I don't think China to challenge that. However, the U.S.-led sort of social global order has been trying to exclude China from, especially in the last 10 years or so. Previously, the U.S. was partnering with China economically, but I think once they saw that China became too strong economically and began to also become more assertive politically, it is really trying to contain China. So now I think Chinese state is quite clear-eyed about what's happening now, and is more interested now in developing close relationship with countries that are traditionally, let's say, the enemy of the U.S. state, or just being overlooked. So that, China's been developing all this relationship with countries in the Middle East, in Africa, in Latin America, etc., that are, the U.S. doesn't really care that much about. Or so I think it's a good thing to some degree, because I think it's it maybe gave some breathing space for other countries to, maybe to develop close relationships on more programmatic grounds, and maybe if means development in certain countries, I think maybe a good thing. But I do think, it doesn't represent kind of socialist alternative to the global order. But I do think there's quite significant development, not because it's sort of getting us towards socialism, but I think it is changing the face of global political order.
Okay, so it's not about the multipolarity of this, that there isn't just such a dominant hegemon, which is the US. We have another question, which is about the cost of labor. So the question is, what was the response of the private sector and the state when the cost of labor went high because of labor struggles?
Yeah. So so I was saying that really through labor struggles and also other demographic factors. Again, this is not unique to China in many ways. The country industrialized and workers struggle, and there's greater demand for workers, and workers' incomes or salaries go up. The response of the state and private sector has been twofold. For private sectors, it's primarily interested in looking for cheap labor, so it's moving elsewhere, right? It's closed down factories for example, in the special economic zones, mostly in the coastal regions in China, into inland. So that's kind of the response of the private sector. But for the state, it's also aligned sort of with its recent developmental strategy, which is sometimes we call it Made in China 2025. It's with this idea that we don't only want low-cost manufacturing, we want high-tech development. So China has been investing for years in high-tech, and this is why China is now able to develop some of the most sophisticated technologies in automobile, in telecommunication, etc. So it's quite happy to be done away with the with low-cost manufacturing. So a lot of that is now moving out of China, but very slowly into places like Cambodia, Vietnam, India, etc., etc.
Okay. And there's another question about what's the relationship between China and Japan? Historically, there have been it's been US allied, and yes. So what is the kind of what do the international relations between China and Japan look like at the moment with China's rise as an international power?
Yeah, it's the relationship has always, of course, been contradictory for a while because Japan during the Second World War colonized large part of Asia, including China. So
Right.
there was that very intense hostilities. But for decades, the relationship is quite amenable, let's say, because it's neighbor, and there was a huge amount of Japanese investment in Chinese factories for decades, since the 80s, since the 90s. But currently, what's happening is the right wing, both in Japan and in Korea, have tried to develop closer alliances, even closer alliances with the US. So actually, the U.S. state is trying to broker this alliance between South Korea and Japan. And with also in South Korea, there's that right wing conservative government right now in power. But of course, there's a lot of contradictions too, because South Korea is at the level of population is also very hostile to Japan, because Japan colonized Korea for 50 years. So the geopolitics is quite tricky, but overall, just taking one small step back, I think it's clear the U.S. state has been trying to essentially encircle China. That's why there's a military base in Okinawa, in Japan, in Korea, while also now sort of military base in Australia, and closer ties with India, with Taiwan, etc. And I think it's essentially trying to build this circle around China to contain it militarily.
Okay. And there's another question about where is the hope for the leftward shift in China? Will it happen with the state or with social movements? Interesting question.
Where's the hope is?
Yeah.
I think it's with social movement and with the population. I think what I think is really interesting, and we touched upon that previously, is because of the when there was so much upward social mobility, when there was so much material gains for even just factory worker, their salaries have been going up. There is people. There's always room for. If there's a lot of dissent, there's a lot of protest, but there was no system-wide sort of critique. I think that's changing because of the economic slowdown, with this contradiction that we began to see in China, which means, like, for especially as I mentioned, for young people, their job prospect, their economic prospect have been diminishing. It already began before COVID, but it was exacerbated by the COVID situation. So I think now more and more people are willing to ask questions, and I think that's an interesting development. But I think for the left, anywhere, I think is to recognize this questioning, this changing consciousness, but also recognize it doesn't necessarily go in the left direction. It could go into right wing direction, right? Like we say a lot of places with right wing populism. So I think it's an interesting moment where things can go in different directions in China.
Okay, so I guess this ties back to how we started the session, which was about the economic miracle, right? So is the economic miracle reaching its limits now? Is it finally reaching its limits, and everything that you've been talking about with the outward expansion, with the One Belt, One Road? So where do you see the next 5 years maybe of economic progress or political progress on the international scene?
Yeah, so I think coming back to this question, of Chinese miracle, or the idea of demystifying this miracle. When you talk about miracle, it gave you the sense like comes out of nowhere,
Right.
and it probably will continue in some way because it's a miracle. First of all, it didn't come out of nowhere. It followed, as I mentioned, other East Asia developmental models. They led developmental model, and also it's not a miracle because it will stop. It will go away. And I think we are seeing the bursting of this miracle and of this Chinese strain. So I think what's going to happen in the next few years, it's everybody's guess. But I do think there are inherent contradictions within capitalism that cannot be easily managed by state policies. I do think the Chinese state right now, we're going back to this idea of disciplining capital to reduce instability in the system. However, I do not think that's enough to overcome some of the fundamental contradiction of capitalism. I think it will probably will get worse for another period of time. But what's important, I think, is to think about the changing consciousness of people and how they question what's happening, and if they can develop more progressive politics. I think that's something to be watching for.
Perfect. Well, that's all we have time for today. So thank you everyone for your questions, but more importantly, thank you so much, Kevin, for giving us an introductory understanding of what the Chinese state and the system looks like at the moment. And we hope this is one of many sessions that we could do with you, and to just further increase our knowledge about what is actually happening, which I think, as you said, is probably the most important thing we can do right now.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Kevin. And the rest of you, I hope you enjoyed the festival. Thank you.